Stop reacting, train your brain to think first. Most people believe they are in charge of their own responses. They are not. What most people call responding is actually something that happens to them, a behavioral output produced by a system that runs faster than deliberate choice, triggered by incoming stimuli and translated into words, decisions, and actions before the thinking mind has been consulted. The irritating comment, the tense meeting, the unexpected problem, the ambiguous message, each of these arrives and something follows. Not something chosen, something generated. The generation is automatic, the delivery is immediate, and the thinking, if it happens at all, arrives afterward to justify what has already been done. This is the default mode of most human cognitive behavior: reaction dressed as response, automaticity experienced as choice, and the gap between what it feels like from the inside, deliberate, appropriate, chosen, and what it actually is, automatic, pattern-driven, calibrated to the emotional state rather than to the genuine requirements of the situation, is where most of the costs of reactive living accumulate. The costs are not always dramatic. They are rarely single catastrophic events. They accumulate in the texture of daily life, the conversation that went sideways because of the too fast reply, the decision that seemed obvious in the moment and turned out to be poorly calibrated to the actual situation, the relationship that has been subtly damaged by the accumulation of many small reactive moments that each seemed justified in isolation, the reputation built slowly by the pattern of how you respond in the moments that reveal character and shaped by the reactive pattern rather than by any deliberate intention. You are here because you know, somewhere in your direct experience, that this pattern is running, that you are faster to respond than the quality of your responses warrants, that there is something between what happens and what you do about it that, if it were longer and more deliberate, would produce consistently better results. That something is what this audiobook builds. 10 chapters, each one a layer of the discipline of thinking before acting, the specific, learnable, trainable capacity to insert genuine deliberation between the stimulus and the response, and to produce from that deliberation a quality of behavior that the reactive mode cannot. Not the occasional disciplined response, the consistent one. Not the effortful intervention into the automatic pattern in moments of high stakes. The rebuilt default, the pattern that runs automatically toward thinking before acting rather than toward acting before thinking. The brain you train is the brain you have. The training begins now. Introduction. The space between. There is a space between what happens to you and what you do about it. Most people's lives run through that space so fast that it is effectively zero. Event arrives, response follows. The speed feels like decisiveness, like natural fluency, like the mark of someone who knows what they want and how they operate. What it actually is, in most cases, is the absence of the deliberation that would have produced a better response, the skipping of the thinking that the space between event and response exists specifically to contain. This audiobook is about expanding that space, not to the point of indecision or paralysis, that is not what deliberate thinking produces, to the point where genuine choice is possible, where the event has been received, assessed with the quality of attention it deserves, and responded to from genuine judgment rather than from automatic pattern. The title uses the word stop because stopping is the foundational act. Not stopping forever, stopping long enough for the thinking to occur. Not stopping everything, stopping the specific pathway from event to automatic response that most people are running, so that the deliberate pathway can be engaged instead. Train your brain to think first is the positive complement. The stopping creates the space, the thinking fills it. The training is what makes both of these happen as a matter of built habit rather than effortful intervention. Chapter 1 begins with an honest examination of the reactive pattern, what it is, how it developed, and what it costs. Chapter 1. The habit of reacting. Most people don't think, they react. This is not a moral observation. It is a description of how the human cognitive system actually operates in its default mode, a mode that most people have never deliberately examined or deliberately modified. The default mode is reaction, the rapid, automatic, pattern-driven behavioral output that the system generates in response to incoming stimuli without the intervention of deliberate assessment. In this mode, the stimulus arrives and the response follows as naturally and automatically as the physical reflex, the hand pulling back from heat before the deliberate mind has registered what happened. The psychological reaction is the cognitive equivalent of the physical reflex. It is produced by the same basic mechanism, the fast, automatic processing system detecting a pattern in incoming information and generating the response that the pattern is associated with. The hostile comment and the defensive reply. The problem and the immediate attempt to solve it before it has been fully understood. The request and the automatic yes or no, based on the first feeling rather than on genuine assessment. The conversation that triggers a specific emotional response and the specific behavior that the emotional response has been trained to produce. These reactions feel like choices because they are accompanied by the subjective experience of having chosen. But the experience of choosing is not the same as having chosen. The reactive person experiences their automatic output as a deliberate act because the deliberate mind, arriving after the automatic processing has produced its output, endorses and justifies the output rather than examining it. The endorsement feels like the original choice. The examination never occurs. Why reaction becomes automatic behavior is explained by the mechanism through which all habits form. Habits are neural infrastructure, the building of efficient, fast-running pathways through the repetition of specific behaviors in response to specific cues. The more consistently a behavior follows a cue, the stronger the neural connection between them becomes, and the more automatically the cue triggers the behavior. At the extreme end of this habituation, the behavior requires essentially no deliberate initiation. It runs on the detection of the cue, below the threshold of conscious awareness. Reactive habits are formed in exactly this way: a specific type of stimulus, a particular tone, a particular type of request, a particular pattern of behavior from a particular type of person has been consistently followed over many repeated instances by a specific behavioral response. The consistency of the pairing has built the neural infrastructure that now makes the pairing automatic. The stimulus arrives and the response follows, not because the person has chosen it, but because the infrastructure of repetition has made the connection between them efficient enough to run without deliberate initiation. The original pairing, in most cases, made some kind of sense at some point. The defensive response to a particular type of criticism was produced by a past situation in which that kind of criticism genuinely warranted defense. The avoidance response to a particular kind of social situation was appropriate in a past context in which that kind of situation was genuinely threatening. The immediate problem-solving impulse was reinforced by past situations in which immediate solutions were genuinely needed. The problem is that the automatic response was calibrated to a past situation and is now being applied to all situations that share the triggering features of that past situation, regardless of whether the current situation actually warrants the same response. The defensive reaction arrives in every critical conversation, whether or not the criticism is genuinely threatening. The avoidance response arrives in every ambiguous social situation, whether or not the situation is genuinely risky. The immediate problem-solving impulse arrives in every problem, whether or not it has been understood well enough to solve effectively. Emotional reflexes and impulsive decisions are the specific forms that habitual reaction takes in high stakes, emotionally activated situations, and they are the forms that produce the most consistent and most costly outcomes. An emotional reflex is the automatic behavioral expression of an emotional state, running below the level of deliberate awareness and producing the behavioral output appropriate to the emotional state, regardless of whether that behavioral output is appropriate to the actual situation. The anger reflex produces aggressive or defensive behavior because anger states have been consistently followed by such behavior. The anxiety reflex produces avoidance or over-preparation or reassurance seeking because anxiety states have been consistently followed by those behaviors. The shame reflex produces withdrawal or deflection or over-explanation because shame states have been consistently followed by those responses. The emotional reflex is not irrational. It was rational at the time it was formed. It was the behavioral output that the emotional state warranted in the situation that trained the reflex. What makes it costly is the generalization. The emotional state of the same type now triggers the same behavioral output regardless of the specific characteristics of the current situation. Because the connection is between the emotional state and the behavior rather than between the specific situation and the behavior. Impulsive decisions are the additional form of the same mechanism. They are the fast, poorly assessed choices that the activated emotional state drives toward, the choices that are calibrated to the immediate feeling rather than to the actual characteristics of the decision and its consequences. The impulsive decision feels decisively right in the moment because the emotional state generating it is producing both the choice and the sense of its rightness simultaneously. The certainty and the conclusion arrive together, which makes the certainty feel like evidence for the conclusion rather than like a feature of the state that produced both. The hidden cost of reacting too fast is not primarily found in the single dramatic errors that occasionally result from impulsive decisions. It is found in the accumulated cost of many small reactive moments across the full span of a life. Consider the compounding effect of consistently reactive communication. Each too fast reply that was less accurate than a considered one would have been. Each defensive escalation that turned a manageable difficulty into a genuine conflict. Each premature commitment that closed off options that patience would have preserved. Each emotional expression that provided information about where the emotional triggers are to people who may use that information. None of these in isolation is catastrophic. Across years, they constitute a significant gap between the life that the reactive pattern is building and the life that a more deliberate one would have produced. The cost is not only in outcomes, it is in the internal experience of being reactive, the accumulated sense of being someone whose behavior is governed by conditions rather than chosen from genuine intention. The specific self-knowledge that the reactive person carries that they cannot fully trust their own responses to hold across the range of situations they will encounter, because the holding depends on the conditions rather than on the capacity they have built. The antidote to this is not trying harder to be deliberate. It is building the neural infrastructure that makes deliberate thinking the automatic first response to incoming stimuli. That building is what the remaining 9 chapters accomplish. Chapter 2. The Thinking Gap. Between the event and the reaction there is a short space. Intelligence lives in that space. This chapter is the conceptual center of the entire audiobook. The thinking gap, the interval between what happens and what you do about it, is not just a metaphor for deliberation. It is a real, exploitable space in the cognitive architecture that, when occupied by genuine thought rather than skipped in the rush to response, consistently produces better outcomes than the uninterrupted automatic reaction would have. The gap exists because the human cognitive architecture has 2 distinct processing systems running in parallel, and they operate at different speeds. The fast system produces the automatic, pattern-driven, emotionally informed reaction in milliseconds. The slow system produces the deliberate, evidence-based, considering response in seconds to minutes. Both are real. Both are always available. What determines which system governs the behavioral output in any given moment is primarily the presence or absence of the deliberate initiation of the slow system before the fast system's output has already been executed. The thinking gap is the interval in which that initiation can occur. It is not a large interval, often just a few seconds between the stimulus and the automatic response. But those seconds, if used deliberately rather than skipped automatically, are the entire difference between the reactive person and the deliberate one. The psychological pause is the deliberate act of occupying the thinking gap. Not a passive waiting, not a hesitation produced by uncertainty, a positive, active choice to withhold the automatic output long enough for the slow system to begin its work. It is the specific moment of self-interruption I have felt the pull of the automatic response. I recognize that the pull is the fast system's output, and I am choosing to hold it in suspension long enough to see whether what the slow system produces is different and better. The psychological pause requires something specific and important: the ability to tolerate the brief discomfort of holding the unexecuted response. This discomfort is real. The fast system has generated the output and is pressing for its execution. The emotional activation that produced the output is maintaining the pressure. The social expectation of prompt response, the norm that delays in conversation signal uncertainty or weakness, is adding another layer of pressure toward immediate execution. Tolerating this pressure is the foundational skill of the thinking gap practice, not the content of what the slow system produces that comes after. The prior skill is simply the ability to hold the automatic output in suspension long enough for the slow system to be consulted. Everything else depends on this ability. The good news is that the tolerance is trainable. The discomfort of holding the unexecuted response is greatest in the earliest practice instances, when the gap is new and the pressure is most acute. With consistent practice, with the consistent insertion of the pause across the many small opportunities that ordinary social interaction provides, the tolerance builds. The discomfort reduces. The pause becomes less effortful and more automatic. Eventually, the pause itself becomes the new habit, the new automatic first response to incoming stimuli. rather than the effortful intervention into the old automatic first response. Why smart people slow their reactions is a question worth addressing directly. Because intelligence is often associated in common understanding with speed, with the quick grasp, the fast response, the immediate and impressive connection. And the association is not entirely wrong. High-speed processing is a feature of certain kinds of intelligence, but it is a feature that is specifically irrelevant to, and often counterproductive for, the kind of intelligence that most consequential real-world situations require. The real-world situations that most matter, the complex interpersonal situations, the multivariable decisions, the high-stakes communications, the judgment calls in conditions of genuine uncertainty are not well served by speed. They are well served by depth, by the quality of the assessment rather than its velocity, by the consideration of factors that the immediate fast-mode processing missed, by the checking of the initial conclusion against the disconfirming evidence that the confirmation-based fast processing was not attending to. Genuinely smart people whose intelligence produces reliably good outcomes in complex situations slow their reactions not because they lack the speed of fast processing, but because they understand its specific limitations. They know that the first output of the fast system in a complex situation is frequently only partly right, that the additional processing of the slow system regularly improves on it, and that the cost of the additional processing time is almost always smaller than the cost of executing the unimproved fast system output. This understanding is itself a clearable insight. You do not have to be born with the intuition that slow thinking is better thinking in complex situations. You can develop it through the specific experience of practicing the pause, noticing when the slow system's output improves on the fast system's first offering, and building the evidence base that makes the value of the pause genuinely believed rather than merely intellectually endorsed. Creating space for rational thinking is the positive purpose of the thinking gap, what the space is for, not just what it prevents. The space creates four specific things that the uninterrupted automatic response forecloses. The first is accurate description. The space allows the situation to be described more accurately, with the emotional charge of the fast system's response beginning to reduce slightly and the perceptual distortions it produces beginning to be corrected. What did actually happen, as distinct from what the activated emotional state is interpreting as having happened. The second is option expansion. The space allows the full range of available responses to be identified, rather than only the single response or narrow range that the fast system presented as the obvious or only option. What other responses exist here, beyond the one I am already feeling pulled toward? The third is consequence extension. The space allows the time horizon of consequence evaluation to expand beyond the immediate. Not just what this response does right now, but what it creates as conditions in the next day, the next month, the next year of the relationship or the situation it is embedded in. The fourth is value alignment. The space allows the question of which response is most consistent with genuine values and long-term intentions, as distinct from which response most satisfies the immediate emotional state. Is the response I am about to give the one I would choose if I were operating at my best? Or is it the one that the current state is driving me toward? These four things: accurate description, option expansion, consequence extension, value alignment, or what rational thinking adds to the fast system's output. None of them are available without the space. The space is created by the pause. The pause is built by the practice that the remaining chapters describe. Chapter 3. Why emotions hijack decisions. Sometimes your decisions are not made by your mind. They are made by your emotional state. The word hijack is precise here. In ordinary conditions, the deliberate mind has meaningful governance over the behavioral output it participates in the decision, considers the evidence, and produces something that reflects genuine judgment alongside the emotional input. Emotional hijacking is a different condition. The emotional activation is strong enough to effectively take over the cognitive process, governing it toward the conclusions and outputs the emotional state prefers while generating the felt experience of deliberate reasoning. The felt experience of reasoning is the specific feature that makes emotional hijacking so difficult to recognize and resist from the inside. The person who has been emotionally hijacked is not experiencing themselves as running on pure emotion. They are experiencing themselves as thinking through a situation clearly, and the conclusions they are reaching feel well supported and obviously right. The hijacking is invisible from inside the hijacked state because the hijacking has recruited the reasoning process in its service. The reasoning is occurring, but it is reasoning in service of an emotionally predetermined conclusion rather than reasoning toward the most accurate conclusion regardless of what the emotional state prefers. Understanding this mechanism changes the standard of what counts as evidence that you are thinking clearly. The felt experience of clear thinking is not sufficient evidence, because it is entirely compatible with being emotionally hijacked. The real indicators of clear thinking are structural. Was the conclusion reached before or after the evidence was examined? Did the examination of evidence include genuine engagement with the disaffirming evidence, or primarily with the confirming evidence? Did the options considered include options that were inconsistent with the emotionally preferred conclusion? Are only options in the range of the emotional preference? The brain survival mode is the physiological substrate of emotional hijacking. The specific set of changes in cognitive architecture and resource allocation that activated emotional states produce. The brain in survival mode is not a broken or degraded system. It is a highly optimized system operating in the specific mode. It was designed for rapid, forceful, pattern-based response to conditions perceived as threatening or urgently important. In this mode, the resources that slow, deliberate processing requires the working memory capacity, the attentional bandwidth, the access to the prefrontal systems that support complex reasoning or partially redirected toward the fast, threat response systems that the activation is mobilizing. The result is a system that is fast and confident but has reduced access to the specific cognitive capacities that complex situations require. The speed and confidence are genuine features of the activated state. The reduced access is also genuine. The combination real speed and confidence alongside reduced quality of reasoning is the specific cognitive signature of survival mode operation. And it explains why decisions made in this state often seem obviously right in the moment and turn out to be significantly less good upon reflection. Emotional shortcuts and bad decisions are the behavioral outputs of survival mode operation, and they follow a consistent pattern that is recognizable once it has been named. The emotional shortcut is the substitution of the emotional response for the analytical response in the processing of a decision. Rather than assessing the full complexity of the decision, gathering the relevant information, Identifying the available options, evaluating their respective consequences. The emotional shortcut generates a response based on the emotional state's orientation toward the situation. Does this feel like a yes or a no? Does this feel consistent or inconsistent with my existing position? Does this feel like something I want to engage with or something I want to avoid? These emotional short-circuit evaluations are not always wrong. In familiar domains, with accumulated experience that has calibrated the emotional response to accurately track relevant features of situations, the emotional shortcut can produce reliable outputs. The experienced professional whose gut feeling about a situation is well elaborated by years of relevant pattern recognition is using the emotional shortcut productively. The problem is that the emotional shortcut does not distinguish between the familiar domain where it is well elaborated and the unfamiliar or novel situation where it is not. It runs the same fast, emotionally driven process regardless of whether the relevant pattern recognition has been accurately built. And in unfamiliar or emotionally charged situations, the emotional calibration is frequently poor. The emotional response is tracking the superficial features of the situation that match past experience rather than the substantive features that are actually most relevant to the current decision. Recognizing emotional hijacking is the specific perceptual skill that interrupts this process before it produces its typical poor outcomes. The recognition requires a specific set of markers that reliably indicate the hijacking condition. The speed of the certainty has the conclusion arrived before enough evidence has been gathered and examined to warrant that level of certainty. The direction of the evidence gathering has the consideration been primarily of evidence that supports the conclusion, or has disconfirming evidence been genuinely sought and engaged? The foreclosure of options. Does the consideration include only options in the range of the emotional preference? Or does it genuinely entertain options the emotional state would prefer not to take? When these markers are present, when certainty has arrived fast, when evidence gathering has been confirmatory rather than exploratory, when the option range has been narrow and emotionally constrained, the recognition is available. This is the hijacked state, and the conclusion it is driving toward deserves additional examination before it is executed as a decision. The recognition is not the solution. It is the prerequisite for the solution. The thinking gap, the slow systems engagement, the expanded assessment that the pause makes possible. Chapter 4 begins the building of the practices that enable this expanded assessment to occur. Chapter 4: Slowing down the mind. The simplest way to think better is to learn how to slow down. This chapter translates the conceptual understanding of the previous chapters into specific, operational practices. The thinking gap is real. Emotional hijacking is real. Knowing these things is necessary and not sufficient. The practices that actually build the capacity to slow the reactive mind are what converts the knowledge into genuine behavioral change. Why speed creates mistakes is the first thing to understand clearly. Because the cultural association between speed and intelligence and the corresponding association between slowing down and weakness or indecision is strong enough that it needs to be directly addressed before the slowing practices can be adopted without ambivalence. Speed creates mistakes in cognitive processing for the same reason it creates mistakes in physical tasks. It reduces the amount of information processed, the number of options considered, and the quality of the error checking that occurs before the output is produced. The fast physical movement completes its trajectory before the sensory feedback that would have allowed correction has been integrated. The fast cognitive response produces its output before the examination that would have revealed its flaws has been conducted. In physical tasks, the error is usually visible and immediate. The badly aimed throw misses the target. The carelessly placed foot turns the ankle. The feedback is direct, the cost is clear, and the lesson is available. In cognitive tasks, the error is frequently delayed and invisible. The too fast decision produces consequences that arrive later, in conditions different from those in which the decision was made, making the causal connection between the speed of the decision and the quality of its outcome difficult to trace. The too fast reply in a difficult conversation produces its relational effects over subsequent interactions, not immediately in the same conversation. The too fast judgment about a person shapes the subsequent treatment of that person in ways that play out across many future interactions. Because the cost of cognitive speed is delayed and often invisible, the corrective feedback that would naturally discourage it is absent or ambiguous. People who make fast decisions often do not have clear evidence that their decisions would have been better if they had been slower. They have partial outcomes and counterfactual unknowns rather than direct comparison. This absence of direct corrective feedback is one of the primary reasons that the cognitive speed habit is so persistent despite its consistent costs. Calm thinking habits are the specific patterns of cognitive behavior that replace the speed default with the quality default, the habits that make the slow system's engagement the natural first response to incoming situations rather than an effortful override of the fast system's automatic output. The most important calm thinking habit is the brief, automatic question that precedes every significant response. What does this situation actually require? Not what is the fast system generating as its output. What does this situation, accurately assessed, actually require from me right now? This question is not elaborate or time-consuming. It takes 2 to 3 seconds. Those seconds insert the quality check that prevents the automatic execution of the fast system's unexamined output. Techniques to slow mental reactions are the specific practices that build the pause capacity, the operational tools that make the thinking gap accessible in the actual conditions where the reactive pull is strongest. The first and most foundational technique is physiological, the deliberate reduction of breath pace and depth when the reactive pull is strongest. The breath is the most directly accessible physiological lever for the nervous system, and deliberately slowing and deepening it produces a measurable shift in the autonomic state from the sympathetic dominant, activated condition that produces the reactive pull toward the parasympathetic dominant condition that makes the slow system more accessible. This effect is not dramatic or instant. It is consistent and real. A slow, deep breath before responding to an emotionally charged communication changes the cognitive quality of the response that follows. Not because the content of the situation has changed, but because the state from which the response is generated has shifted slightly toward the regulated. The second technique is the deliberate label, naming the emotional state that has been activated, briefly and specifically, before responding to the situation that activated it. Not analyzing the emotion or elaborating on it, simply naming it. Frustrated, anxious, provoked, defensive. The act of naming creates a small but real cognitive distance between the emotional state and the self that is experiencing it. The state is acknowledged as a state rather than as a direct perception of reality. This distance, however slight, creates the gap in which the slow system can begin its engagement. The third technique is the deliberate delay of response beyond the social expectation. When the reactive pull is present and the social norm would make an immediate response appear natural and appropriate, choose the fractional delay instead, not the dramatic, visible hesitation, the small, internal delay of a second or two in which the first output of the fast system is briefly held before being executed or replaced. The social cost of this delay is essentially zero. The cognitive benefit is the small but consistent improvement in the quality of the response that the brief holding enables. The fourth technique is the explicit question about the first response. If I send this message, make this decision, or give this reply right now, is it the best version of my response to this situation? Or is it the first version? The first version and the best version are sometimes the same. Often they are not. The question makes the distinction available and creates the choice to wait for the better version rather than executing the first one simply because it arrived first. These techniques are not complex. Their power is not in their sophistication but in their consistent application. Each uses a practice session. Each practice session builds a small increment of the new habit. The accumulation of many small increments is the rebuilt default, the mind that pauses before responding, not as an effortful intervention, but as its natural way of engaging with incoming situations. Slowing down is not the destination. It is the means of access to the quality of thinking that the destination requires. The slow systems work the expanded assessment, the fuller option range, the consequence extension, the value alignment is what produces the genuine improvement. Slowing down is what makes that work possible. The discipline to slow down consistently across the ordinary interactions of ordinary days is where the entire transformation is built. Chapter 5: Replacing Reaction with Strategy. Reaction is weakness, strategy is strength. The difference is the quality of thought between them. The language of this chapter's hook deserves precision. Calling reaction weakness and strategy strength is not a moral judgment, it is a functional observation. In most of the situations that matter, the reactive behavioral output is weaker in the sense of being less effective than the strategic response would be. Weaker not necessarily in forcefulness or visibility, but in accuracy of calibration in the degree to which the response is actually suited to what the situation requires rather than to what the emotional state generated in response to the situation. Strategic thinking, in this context, is not the elaborate calculation of grand plans. It is the specific cognitive quality of choosing responses based on accurate assessment of the situation and its genuine requirements, considering the full picture, including elements beyond the immediate emotional focal point, including consequences beyond the immediate moment, including options beyond the single response the fast system presented as obvious. Strategic thinking versus impulsive behavior is the fundamental contrast that this chapter develops, not as an abstract philosophical distinction, but as the practical difference between two approaches to the same situation that produce systematically different outcomes. Consider the basic anatomy of an impulsive behavioral response. A stimulus arrives. The fast system generates an assessment based on the most salient features of the stimulus and the most activated patterns it matches. An emotional response is produced. The emotional response drives a behavioral impulse. The behavioral impulse is executed with minimal deliberate modification. The full duration of this sequence, from stimulus to behavioral output, is often less than 1 second for familiar trigger types. Now consider the anatomy of a strategic behavioral response to the same stimulus. The stimulus arrives. The fast system generates its assessment. This is not prevented. It is the natural and unavoidable first pass of the system. The thinking gap is occupied. The fast system's output is held in suspension while the slow system is given access to the situation. The slow system expands the description what has actually happened here. Specifically and observationally, it expands the option range what responses are available. Beyond the one the fast system produced, it extends the consequence evaluation what does each available option produce in the next day, the next week, the next year of this situation or relationship. And it applies the genuine values and intentions of the person to the selection which available option best serves what I actually care about here. The output of this sequence is a response that is calibrated to the full assessed situation rather than to the fast system's emotionally driven first reading of the most salient features. It may take 5 to 30 seconds longer than the impulsive response. The quality of the outcome it produces is consistently better. Observing before acting is the specific practice that most concretely instantiates strategic thinking in ordinary situations, and it is a practice with specific mechanics worth describing precisely. Observing, in this context, is the brief period of descriptive attention that precedes any evaluative or behavioral engagement with a situation. It is the practice of receiving the full situation, not just the most salient triggering feature, before beginning to assess and respond to it. The question that anchors it is not what should I do about this, but what is actually here. In a difficult conversation, observing before acting means noticing the full communicative environment, not just the specific words that triggered the reactive response, but the context in which they were delivered, the emotional state of the person delivering them, the structural dynamics of the interaction, the history of the relationship that provides the context for interpreting the current exchange. This broader picture consistently provides information that changes the quality of the response that reveals, for example, that the apparently hostile comment is more accurately understood as the expression of the commenter's own difficulty rather than as a genuine attack on you. A response calibrated to the former is different from and better than a response calibrated to the latter. In a decision situation, observing before acting means attending to the full decision context before beginning to evaluate options. What are the actual parameters of this decision? What information is available and what is not yet available but could be gathered? What are the genuine stakes, not the stakes as the emotional urgency is representing them, but the actual consequences of different choices on the dimensions that actually matter? The observation phase builds the foundation on which the strategy is based. Choosing the best response is the culmination of the strategic approach, not the first response that arrived. Not the most emotionally satisfying response, not the response that most discharges the internal pressure of the activated state, but the response that most accurately serves the genuine requirements of the situation and the genuine intentions of the person making it. Choosing implies that a choice is actually occurring, that among the genuinely available options, one is selected on the basis of deliberate assessment. This implies that the full range of options has been identified, option expansion, that the consequences of each have been considered, consequence extension, and that the selection criterion is the genuine values and intentions of the user rather than the momentary preference of the activated emotional state. The discipline to apply this consistently in the ordinary situations of daily life as well as the high-stakes ones is what converts the concept of strategic thinking into the reality of a different way of moving through the world. Not a theory held intellectually, a practice applied behaviorally, repeatedly, across the situations that ordinary days provide, until the application is no longer effortful but simply how you engage. Chapter 6. Emotional Triggers. Every person has buttons that can be pressed. The trained mind sees the hand before it reaches them. The existence of emotional triggers is not a weakness specific to reactive or undisciplined people. Every person has them specific types of input, behavior, communication, or situation that reliably produce strong emotional activation in response. The triggers are not the problem. They are simply the features of the emotional architecture, the patterns that have been associated with threat or reward or significant past experience, and that the emotional system monitors for and responds to with automatic activation when detected. The problem is the invisibility of the triggers to the person who has them. When a trigger fires below the level of deliberate awareness, the person experiences the emotional activation it produces as a direct response to the current situation, as the accurate reading of something genuinely threatening or offensive or important in the situation rather than as the automatic response to a pattern that matched the trigger. The activation is real. The conclusion that it is produced by the specific features of the current situation is often an overstatement. This invisibility is costly for two reasons. The first is the internal cost. The person is being governed by responses to patterns that may no longer accurately track anything genuinely threatening or important, without being able to examine or modify this governance because they cannot see it. The second is the social cost. Other people can learn to see your triggers from the outside even when you cannot see them from the inside. And people who can see your triggers have a specific capability that is not in your interest. They can produce the activation in you that drives your behavior on demand by providing the triggering input. Social triggers that people use deliberately or automatically fall into specific categories that are recognizable once they have been named. Pride triggers are inputs that signal disrespect, undervaluation, or challenge to the person's sense of their own competence or standing. The public criticism that implies incompetence. The decision made without consultation that implies insufficient importance. The comparison to someone else that implies inferiority. These inputs reliably produce defensive or aggressive activation in people with the corresponding trigger. And the behavioral outputs of that activation, the sharp reply, the defensive escalation, the attempt to reassert status, are entirely predictable to anyone who has learned to see the trigger. Fairness triggers are inputs that signal injustice, violation of expected reciprocity, or unequal treatment, the perceived credit-taking, the inconsistent application of standards, the sense of being asked to do more than others while receiving less than others. These inputs reliably produce resentment and the behavioral patterns associated with resentment in people whose fairness sensitivity is high. The behavioral patterns: withdrawal of cooperation, expressed or demonstrated resentment, the marshalling of evidence for the injustice, or as predictable as the trigger is reliable. Exclusion triggers are inputs that signal social rejection, being left out, or the withdrawal of belonging. the conversation that continues without being addressed to you, the group decision made without your inclusion, the social signal that your membership in the group is conditional or uncertain. These inputs reliably produce anxiety, and the behavioral patterns anxiety drives increased bids for inclusion, heightened sensitivity to further signals, the interpretation of ambiguous communications as confirming the exclusion in people with the corresponding sensitivity. Manipulation through emotions is the deliberate use of trigger knowledge to produce specific behavioral outputs in the target person. This is worth naming directly, because many people underestimate how consistently and systematically their emotional responses are being used to influence their behavior by people who have learned to see the patterns. The manipulation does not always require conscious calculation. Much of it is automatic. The person who has learned through years of interaction with you that specific kinds of criticism produce specific defensive responses uses that learning to produce those responses when it serves their purposes, without necessarily articulating to themselves that they are doing so. The person who has learned that you respond to urgency by accelerating your response time uses urgency signals to produce acceleration, regardless of whether the actual urgency warrants it. More calculated versions are also common. The explicit use of pride sensitivity to produce competitive behavior in someone whose competition is desired. The use of fairness sensitivity to produce resentment toward a third party in someone whose alliance against that party is desired. The use of exclusion sensitivity to produce compliance in someone for whom belonging to the group is important. These are not exotic or unusual tactics. They are ordinary features of ordinary social dynamics, used by ordinary people pursuing ordinary self-interested goals. Recognizing when you are being provoked is the specific perceptual skill that converts trigger awareness into genuine protection against trigger exploitation. The recognition requires, first, the self-knowledge of what your specific trigger patterns or which types of input reliably produce strong activation in you, and what the behavioral outputs of that activation are. This self-knowledge is built through honest observation of your own reactive patterns across many instances and many situations. Not the dramatic explosions, but the ordinary, low-level activations, the small defensiveness, the slight resentment, the mild anxiety, the barely noted urgency. These are the trigger patterns running in their ordinary mode, and observing them honestly across many instances reveals their structure. The recognition requires, second, the in-the-moment awareness of when the activation is occurring, noticing that something has just fired, that the internal state has just shifted from its baseline, that the current emotional pull is the product of a trigger activation rather than of a deliberate assessment of the current situation. This noticing creates the crucial gap. I know that a trigger has just fired. The question is now what actually serves me in this situation, rather than what the trigger activation is driving me toward. That gap between trigger recognition and behavioral output is the specific protection that trigger awareness provides. Not immunity to being provoked. The activation will still occur. The capacity to recognize the activation as activation rather than as accurate perception of the situation, and to choose the response from that recognition rather than from the unexamined automatic output of the triggered state. Chapter 7. Rewiring Thought Patterns. If you always react the same way, your brain is running an old program. New behavior requires new programming. The programming metaphor is imperfect but instructive. The neural pathways that support habitual reactive behavior are not analogous to fixed code that cannot be changed. They are more analogous to well-worn paths in a landscape that can be abandoned in favor of new paths, but only through the consistent effort of traveling the new routes until they become more efficient than the old ones. The old paths do not disappear, they simply become less traveled and less efficiently maintained. The new paths, traveled consistently, become more efficient and eventually more automatic than the old ones were. This is the process of rewiring thought patterns, not the deletion of the old neural infrastructure, but the building of new infrastructure alongside it and the gradual shift of the default traffic from the old routes to the new ones. The shift happens through the consistent practice of the new pattern in the situations where the old pattern would previously have run automatically. Every instance of the new response where the old response would have occurred is both a repetition of the new pattern and a reduction in the automatic dominance of the old one. Mental habits and conditioning is the broader frame within which individual thought patterns exist, the organized system of habitual cognitive responses that constitutes the reactive person's operating mode. The conditioning is the product of history of the accumulated experience of responding in specific ways to specific types of situations, of having those responses reinforced through their outcomes even when the outcomes were poor. The reinforcement of habits is not always positive. It is sometimes the relief of tension rather than the production of genuinely good results, and of building, through the accumulated repetitions, the neural infrastructure that makes the responses automatic. Understanding conditioning changes the relationship to reactive patterns. The person who understands that their reactive patterns are conditioned responses, the products of their history rather than expressions of their character, has a different relationship to changing them than the person who experiences them as simply who they are. Conditioning can be changed. Character feels fixed. The reframe from character to conditioning opens the possibility of deliberate modification in a way that the character framing does not. This does not mean that conditioning is easy to change, or that understanding it as conditioning is sufficient to change it. Understanding is the opening, practice is the change. But the opening matters. The person who does not believe their patterns can change will not invest the sustained practice that changing them requires. Breaking automatic responses requires the specific application of the pattern interruption practice, the deliberate insertion of novel behavior in the situations where the automatic response would ordinarily run. The practice begins with the identification of specific situations in which specific automatic responses reliably appear. Not the general claim of being reactive, the specific trigger type, the specific emotional activation it produces, the specific behavioral output that activation drives. The more specific the identification, the more targetable the interruption practice is. A general intention to be less reactive is a much less effective change agent than the specific intention to pause before responding to this specific type of criticism from this specific type of person in this specific type of situation. The interruption itself is the brief replacement of the automatic first behavior with a deliberate alternative. Not necessarily a fully worked-out strategic response at the stage of pattern interruption. The alternative only needs to be something other than the automatic response. The pause itself, the breath, the single question held before reply, these are the early stages of the interruption practice. They do not need to produce a brilliant alternative response to be valuable. They need to break the automatic execution of the old pattern, which is the prerequisite for building the new one. The interruption is most difficult in the earliest instances when the old pattern is most powerful and the new alternative is weakest and most effortful. Each subsequent interruption of the same pattern in the same trigger situation reduces the dominance of the old pattern slightly and strengthens the new one slightly. The curve of change is not linear. The early instances are hardest, and the improvement in each subsequent instance is small, but the direction is consistent, and the accumulation of many small improvements eventually produces the shifted default. Building new thinking patterns is the positive complement to breaking the old ones, the construction of the specific deliberate alternatives that the interruption practice creates space for. The new pattern is not simply the absence of the old one. It is a specific, practiced, consistently applied alternative that eventually develops its own neural infrastructure and its own degree of automexity. The pattern that pauses before responding to criticism. The pattern that observes before evaluating. The pattern that extends the time horizon before deciding. The pattern that checks the first conclusion before acting on it. Each of these is a pattern in the sense that a habit is a pattern, a consistent response to a consistent type of situation, applied reliably enough that it becomes the default rather than the exception. The difference from the old reactive patterns is the direction the default runs toward: deliberation rather than toward reaction, toward the slow system rather than exclusively toward the fast one. The construction of new thinking patterns is not a project with a completion date. It is an ongoing practice that deepens indefinitely, the patterns becoming more automatic over time, more reliably available in the conditions that test them most, more fully integrated into the default cognitive mode. The practice continues as long as it is practiced. The depth of the rewiring reflects the consistency and duration of the practice. Chapter 8. Calm decision making. The best decisions are made from stillness, the worst ones from agitation. The relationship between internal state and decision quality is one of the most consistent and most practically significant findings in the psychology of judgment. The internal state at the time of a decision is not a neutral backdrop against which the decision is made. It is an active participant in the decision process, shaping what information is attended to, which options are considered, how consequences are weighted, and what threshold of confidence triggers the commitment to a choice. In an agitated state, the decision is faster, more confident, and calibrated to a narrower and more emotionally filtered version of the situation than the full, clear state assessment would produce. In a calm state, the decision is slower, more genuinely uncertain about the aspects of the situation that are actually uncertain, and calibrated to a broader and more accurate picture of what the situation actually contains. Slower and more uncertain, in the context of complex real-world decisions, is not a description of weaker decision-making. It is a description of better calibrated decision-making, of a process whose speed and confidence more accurately reflect the actual quality of the information it is working from. Rational evaluation is the specific cognitive process that calm decision-making enables. The systematic, evidence-based assessment of a decision situation that the fast mode, emotional shortcut process cannot produce. Rational evaluation does not require perfect information or unlimited time. It requires the specific process defining the actual decision to be made with precision. identifying the information that is relevant to it and distinguishing this from the information that is not. Identifying the available options with genuine breadth rather than the narrow range that emotional narrowing produces. Evaluating the consequences of each option across the full relevant time horizon rather than only the immediate one. And making the selection on the basis of the criterion that genuinely matters, which is not always the same as the criterion that feels most important in the current emotional state. This process is not always elaborate or time-consuming. For many decisions, a clear-headed application of these steps takes 2 to 3 minutes rather than 30 seconds and produces a significantly better choice. The investment of the additional 2 minutes is almost always worth the improvement in the decision quality. The challenge is not the time requirement, it is the emotional pressure toward the faster, less examined decision that the urgency of the activated state is producing. Separating facts from emotions is the specific practice within rational evaluation that most directly addresses the distortion that emotional states introduce into the decision process. Every decision is embedded in both factual content and emotional content. The factual content is what has happened, what the options are, what the consequences of each option are likely to be, the objective features of the decision situation that would be described the same way by any observer with access to the same information. The emotional content is the significance that the situation has for the person making the decision, what they care about, what they fear, what the different options mean to their sense of self and their relationships. Both kinds of content are legitimate inputs to a decision. The emotional content carries real information about values and priorities that the purely factual analysis would miss. The problem is when the emotional content is treated as factual, when what I feel about this situation is used as evidence about the objective characteristics of the situation rather than as information about my own emotional relationship to it. The fear that a risky option will fail is real information about my risk tolerance and my relationship to the potential downside. It is not reliable evidence that the option will actually fail. The desire for a specific outcome is real information about what I value. It is not reliable evidence that the desired outcome is actually more likely than the analysis of the objective situation suggests. Separating these, maintaining the distinction between the emotional signal and the factual content, is what rational evaluation requires and what the calm state makes possible. Strategic thinking in everyday situations is the practical expression of calm decision-making extended to the ordinary decisions of daily life, not reserved for the high stakes, explicitly identified decision moments, but applied as a consistent quality of cognitive engagement across all the situations that require choices. The everyday decisions are not trivial. They are the substance of the life, the pattern of how you communicate, what you commit to, how you manage the minor difficulties and the minor opportunities that constitute most of a day. The cumulative quality of these everyday decisions, made consistently from a calm strategic orientation rather than from the reactive default, is what most significantly determines the quality of the life they are building. Building the calm decision-making habit requires the same consistent practice that all the preceding chapters have described: the application of the approach across the ordinary situations of ordinary days. Beginning with the smallest decisions and the mildest emotional activations, and building the habit through the accumulation of practice instances until the approach is the natural way of engaging with decisions rather than the deliberate override of the natural way. The calm state is not always available. There will be decisions that must be made from inside emotional activation, where the ideal of the fully calm and fully rational process is not achievable. In those situations, the partial application of the calm decision-making approach, even a single breath and a single question before committing consistently, produces better results than the full reactive execution of the activated state's first output. Partial practice in imperfect conditions is still practice. And practice, whatever the conditions, is still what builds the capacity. Chapter 9. Mastering the mental pause. A single second of pause can change the outcome of an entire conversation. Chapter 2 introduced the thinking gap as a concept. This chapter builds the operational mastery of the pause in the specific context of real-time social interaction, the domain in which the reactive pull is strongest. The social cost of the pause is most visible, and the quality difference between the reactive and the deliberate response is most immediately consequential. Social interaction is the primary arena of reactive behavior for most people because it combines the strongest triggers with the most direct social feedback. The emotional triggers of interpersonal communication, pride, belonging, fairness, status are among the most powerful available. The social expectation of prompt, smooth response is among the most constant environmental pressures toward immediacy. And the consequences of poor reactive responses in social situations, the damaged relationships, the misunderstandings, the escalations that the calmer response would have prevented, are among the most concretely experienced costs of the reactive default. The power of silence in social interaction is real and specific, and it is worth understanding in its mechanics because many people avoid silence from the assumption that it is socially costly, that pausing before responding communicates weakness, uncertainty, or disrespect for the other person. The assumption is largely wrong. In most conversational contexts, the brief, deliberate pause before response communicates something specific and valuable, that what has been said is being genuinely considered rather than reflexively responded to. This communication has several positive effects on the interaction. It tells the other person that their contribution is being taken seriously rather than simply reacted to. It creates a quality of attentiveness in the interaction that most people experience as respectful. And it establishes the expectation that your responses are considered rather than reflexive, an expectation that significantly increases the weight your contributions carry when they are offered. The silence also creates a specific attentional dynamic described in earlier audiobooks of this series. The space that a pause creates between a statement and a response becomes an attentional container that heightens the weight of what fills it. The response that arrives after a genuine pause lands differently than the immediately reflexive response. It carries the implicit communication that it was selected, which makes it more significant than the response that arrived before selection could have occurred. Choosing when to respond is the specific strategic skill that mastery of the mental pause enables, the capacity to select not just how to respond but when, based on the genuine assessment of what timing serves the interaction and the goals within it. Most people respond when they have something to say and the conversational floor appears available. This is the default, the conventional social expectation of prompt turn-taking. The strategic communicator responds when their response will be most effective, when the other person has finished expressing the full content of what they are communicating rather than at the first available pause. When the emotional temperature of the interaction is at the point where the offered content will be most receivable rather than most defended against. When the contribution will most effectively serve the direction and quality of the exchange. The practice of deliberate response timing requires the situational reading described in Chapter 5, the awareness of the current state of the interaction, the emotional temperature, the attentional orientation, the developmental phase of the exchange. This reading allows the strategic selection of the response moment rather than the default automatic filling of the first available response opportunity. The most common application is the simple holding of a contribution until the other person has fully completed their communication. Most people respond before the other person has finished at the first pause that indicates the floor is potentially available. This premature response frequently misses the full content of what the other person was communicating, which was still developing when the response preempted it. The held response, offered after the other person has genuinely concluded, is working from the complete communication rather than the partial one, which consistently produces better quality engagement. Psychological control in conversation is the phrase that captures what mastery of the mental pause and deliberate response timing produces at the level of the overall social interaction. Control here is not the domination of the other person. It is the governance of your own participation in the interaction, the maintenance of genuine choice about what you contribute, when you contribute it, and how it is offered. The reactive person in a conversation is governed by the interaction. They respond to whatever the other person offers, at the speed the social expectation specifies, in the emotional register that their triggered state produces. They are following the interaction rather than participating in it as a genuine agent. The person who has built the mental pause capacity is genuinely participating, choosing their contributions, selecting their moments, offering responses that reflect deliberate assessment rather than automatic pattern execution. The interaction is still genuinely two-sided, but one side is more deliberately constituted than the other, and that deliberate constitution produces a consistent quality difference in the contribution and a consistent asymmetry in the degree to which each party is governing their own participation. This asymmetry is not manipulative. It is the natural consequence of one person having built a genuine capacity that the other person has not yet built. The person with the pause capacity is not controlling the interaction. They are simply in genuine control of themselves within it. And genuine self-governance in a social interaction is the specific form of social capability that everything in this audiobook has been building toward. The mental pause is the smallest unit of that self-governance. A second or two, the space between the stimulus and the response. The gap where the intelligence lives. Master the smallest unit and the larger capacity follows. Chapter 10. Becoming a thoughtful person. When you stop reacting, you start directing your own life. The word directing is precise. Not controlling life contains too many genuinely uncontrollable elements for that to be the accurate aspiration. Directing, bringing genuine agency to the domain that is genuinely yours, which is the quality of your own behavioral responses to the events and situations that life produces. Not determining what happens, determining what you do about it. Deliberately, from genuine assessment and genuine values rather than automatically from conditioned pattern. The thoughtful person in the title of this chapter is a specific kind of person, not the intellectually sophisticated person, not the introspective person, not the academically trained person. The person who thinks before acting, who brings genuine deliberation to the situations that their life contains, as a consistent practice rather than an occasional achievement, who has built the pause into the default operating mode of their cognitive system, so that the space between event and response is real and inhabited by genuine thinking rather than crossed at reactive speed. This person is not a different personality type from the reactive person. They are the reactive person who is built, through the practices this audiobook describes, a different cognitive default. The same person, different neural infrastructure, different habits, different relationship to the space between what happens and what they do about it. Calm awareness is the internal quality that characterizes the thoughtful person's ongoing cognitive mode, not the dramatically calm person in the dramatic moment, but the person who brings a quality of settled attentiveness to ordinary situations as a matter of how they engage with the world. Calm awareness is different from passive attention. It is active, engaged, fully present, but without the urgency that reactive engagement brings. The calm-aware person is noticing more because they are less occupied with managing their own reactions to what they are noticing. They are receiving the full situation, the content, the context, the emotional dynamics, the structural features, rather than the emotionally filtered version that the activated, reactive engagement perceives, and they are receiving it with enough internal space to hold it before responding, to examine it before concluding, to choose a response before executing it. This quality of awareness is not a special state that requires unusual conditions to maintain. It is the ordinary state of the person who has built the pause, reduced the automatic reactive default through consistent practice, and developed the habit of genuine presence in the situations they move through rather than the conditioned reaction to pattern features of those situations. Conscious decision-making is the specific cognitive practice that calm awareness enables across the full range of choices, from the largest, most explicitly identified decisions to the smallest, most ordinary ones. Most decisions in an ordinary day are made without being identified as decisions at all. The tone of the reply, the level of effort invested in a task, the degree of attention given to a conversation, the choice of whether to push back on something or let it pass. These are choices. They shape behavior and produce consequences, but they are typically made automatically by the pattern-based fast system, without being recognized as moments in which genuine choice is possible. Conscious decision-making is the expanded awareness that these are choices, that the automatic behavior of the reactive default is not the only available behavior, that each of these ordinary moments contains the option of a different response than the one the conditioned pattern would produce. This awareness does not require the elaboration of all these small choices into deliberate processes. It requires the recognition that they are choices, and the periodic application of genuine deliberation to the ones that warrant it. With practice, the recognition becomes more automatic and the deliberation becomes less effortful. The thoughtful person does not experience every small choice as a weighty deliberation to be consciously managed. They experience it as the natural, fluid expression of a cognitive style that brings genuine consideration to situations rather than automatic pattern execution. The consideration has become the default. The reactive execution has become the exception. Living with deliberate thinking is the sustained, ongoing expression of this transformation, not a state achieved once and permanently maintained, but a practice continuously enacted across the situations that daily life provides. Deliberate thinking as a way of living is not slower or more laborious than reactive living. In its mature form, once the practices have been built into genuine habits and the new neural infrastructure is well established, it is no more effortful than the reactive default was. It is simply different in kind, engaging with situations from the slow system's capabilities rather than from the fast system's automatic outputs, bringing genuine choice to the behavioral responses that the reactive default produced without choice. The quality of life that this different kind of living produces is not better in the sense of being free from difficulty or pressure or the full range of demanding situations that any engaged life contains. It is better in the sense of being genuinely chosen, of being more accurately an expression of what the person actually values and actually intends, rather than of the conditioned patterns that their history built without deliberate input from the values and intentions that developed alongside them. This is the identity shift that the entire audiobook has been building toward. Not the acquisition of a set of skills to be deployed in specific high-stakes situations. The transformation of the default cognitive mode from reactive to deliberate, from pattern execution to genuine choice, from the fast system's automatic output to the slow system's considered engagement. The transformation is not complete at the end of this audiobook. It is initiated by it. The completion is in the practice in every ordinary moment of ordinary days that the practices are applied, in every instance of the pause that builds the new default, in the accumulated evidence of many deliberate choices that gradually shifts the self-concept from the reactive person managing their reactions to the thoughtful person whose deliberation is simply how they function. That person is becoming available to you. The practice is how you complete the becoming. Closing. Think first. 10 chapters, 1 practice at 10 depths. The practice is simple to name. It is demanding to build. And it is entirely worth building because the person who has built it is living from a fundamentally different relationship to their own behavior, a relationship in which the behavior is genuinely chosen rather than automatically executed, in which the space between what happens and what is done about it is real and inhabited by genuine intelligence rather than crossed at reactive speed. Chapter 1, named The Reactive Default. Honestly, not a character flaw but a trained pattern, built through the repetition of automatic responses that now run faster than deliberate choice. The hidden cost not in dramatic catastrophes but in the accumulated texture of a life built from reactive moments, and the opening for change if the pattern was built through repetition. It can be changed through different repetition. Chapter 2 identified the lever, the thinking gap, the short space between the event and the response that most people cross automatically but that, occupied deliberately, consistently produces better behavioral outputs than the uninterrupted reactive execution. The psychological pause is the act of occupying that space. The specific things the space creates: accurate description, option expansion, consequence extension, value alignment, and the one prerequisite that precedes all of them, the tolerance of the brief discomfort of holding the unexecuted response. Chapter 3 mapped the mechanism that most reliably defeats the pause: emotional hijacking, the condition in which the emotional activation has recruited the reasoning process in service of a predetermined conclusion. producing the felt experience of clear thinking while actually generating the rationalization of an emotionally driven output. The brain's survival mode is the physiological substrate. The emotional shortcut is the decision-making expression. And the specific marker speed of certainty, confirmatory evidence gathering, foreclosed option range that allow recognition of the hijacked state from inside it. Chapter 4 built the operational practices that slow the reactive mind, the deliberate breath, the emotional label, the fractional response delay, the first versus best question. Each technique small, each consistent in its effect, each a practice session in the new habit being built, and the reframe of speed as a cognitive liability in complex situations rather than as a virtue. Chapter 5 elevated the frame from stopping the reaction to actively building the strategic alternative, observing before acting, expanding the option range genuinely, choosing the best response rather than the first response. The anatomy of the strategic response compared to the anatomy of the impulsive one, same duration. Genuinely different quality, consistently better outcomes. Chapter 6 addressed the social dimension of the reactive default emotional triggers, the specific types of triggering inputs that reliably produce strong activation, how other people learn to use those triggers deliberately or automatically to produce behavioral outputs in you that serve their purposes rather than yours. The recognition practice, noticing when a trigger has fired, distinguishing the activation from the accurate perception of the situation it masquerades as, choosing from the recognition rather than from the unexamined triggered state. Chapter 7 made the neurological case for the practice. Mental habits are conditioned neural infrastructure, and conditioning can be changed through different repetition, breaking automatic responses through the specific identification and interruption of the target pattern, building new thinking patterns through the consistent practice of the deliberate alternative. The rewiring is slow, the direction is consistent, and the depth of the change reflects the duration and consistency of the practice. Chapter 8 built the calm decision-making architecture, rational evaluation as the systematic process that the regulated state makes possible. The separation of facts from emotional content, not to remove the emotional signal from the assessment, but to receive it as information about values rather than as evidence about objective reality. Strategic thinking in everyday situations as the consistent quality of deliberate cognitive engagement that shapes the cumulative pattern of a life. Chapter 9 applied everything to the most demanding domain, real-time social interaction. The power of silence as deliberate communication of genuine consideration. Choosing when to respond after the other person has genuinely concluded rather than at the first available pause. When the emotional temperature is most conducive to being heard. When the timing serves the iteration's genuine requirements. Psychological control in conversation as the self-governance of your own participation, not the management of the other person, but the genuine agency in your own behavioral contribution. And Chapter 10 named the destination the thoughtful person, not a personality type, but a cognitive default, built through the consistent practice of thinking before acting until thinking before acting is simply how you function. Calm awareness as the ongoing internal quality. Conscious decision-making as the expanded recognition that ordinary behavioral moments are choices. Living with deliberate thinking as the sustained, mature expression of the entire transformation. The title of this audiobook is a direct instruction. Stop reacting, not sometimes. Not in the high-stakes moments. consistently in the ordinary moments that constitute most of a life, because that is where the pattern is built in the small moments, not the dramatic ones. Train your brain to think first, not as a permanent struggle against a natural tendency, as the construction of a new natural tendency through the accumulated practice that makes it automatic. The brain you train is the brain you have. The training is the practice. The practice is available in every ordinary moment that follows. The event arrives. The reactive pull fires. You notice it. You pause. You think. You choose. That sequence is the entire discipline. Simple. Demanding. Entirely worth building. Think first.